Your daughter cancelled your Medicare. That was the first sentence the doctor spoke after glancing at his computer screen, and it sliced through me sharper than any scalpel could. I sat there on the paper-covered table, expecting to hear about my blood pressure, or maybe another lecture about cholesterol. And instead, I was told that the one thing I thought no one could take away from me, the insurance I had worked for, paid, into and trusted, was gone. For a second I thought he was joking, that maybe this was some kind of clerical mistake, because surely no system could simply erase decades of contributions with a few keystrokes. But the doctor didn't smile, he didn't laugh, he just tapped the screen with his pen and said again, more carefully this time, that the coverage had been terminated at the request of my legal guardian. The words made no sense, because I had never signed over guardianship to anyone. I am 72 years old. Yes, my joints ache in the morning, and I walk slower than I once did. But my mind is sharp, sharper than many folks half my age. I balance my checkbook to the penny. I remember every due date, every appointment, every birthday. I have lived too many lives inside this one body to let anyone tell me that I am confused. And yet the doctor was saying it plainly. Someone had authority over me, and that someone had called and shut off the only medical safety net I had. I left the exam room in a haze, clutching my purse against my chest like a shield. And that's when I saw her, my daughter, my only child. She was leaning casually against the wall near the water fountain, her phone still glowing in her hand, her coat perfectly pressed, her lips curved into a smile that wasn't joy, wasn't relief, but something sharper, crueler. She tilted her head, caught my eye, and said in a voice that carried down the hallway, "Don't worry, Mama. I'll take care of you from now on." Then she slipped her phone into her bag and started walking toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor like hammers driving nails into my heart. I wanted to stop her, to demand why she would do this, how she could stand there and smirk while stripping me of the independence I had worked a lifetime to secure. But the words lodged in my throat, heavy with years of sacrifice and trust. This was the child I had raised through hunger and storms, the girl whose braids I had done before school, the teenager I had defended when the world called her too bold, the woman I had supported through heartbreak and mistakes. And now, here she was, my daughter, calm as Sunday morning, telling me that she had cancelled my insurance like it was a favor. I followed slowly, the linoleum under my shoes squeaking as if protesting each step. The receptionist at the desk asked if I wanted to reschedule, speaking gently as if I were fragile glass about to crack. I muttered something about calling later, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, and pushed open the door to the parking lot. The sunlight hit me like a slap. I saw her across the pavement, already on the phone again, laughing, her voice light, her shoulders relaxed. She didn't wait for me, didn't glance back. I stood there, feeling the weight of betrayal heavier than the purse on my arm. All my life I had been told that if I worked hard, paid my dues, and stayed responsible, the system would be there when I needed it. But I hadn't counted on my own child becoming the system's thief, using paperwork and signatures to steal what sweat and years had earned. For decades, I scrubbed floors in houses where women barely looked at me. I served food to children who never learned my name. I changed sheets for patients who moaned in the dark. I carried all of that, believing that at least old age would bring some measure of peace. And yet, here I was, standing on cracked asphalt, watching my daughter smile as if she had won a game, while my future, my health, my dignity, was being signed away without my consent. I tightened my coat around me, the winter wind biting at my neck, and told myself I would not crumble. Not here, not in front of strangers, not while she was still within earshot. I swallowed the lump in my throat, lifted my chin, and whispered under my breath, "Lord, don't let me break." Not like this. When I got back home that evening, the silence of the house pressed down on me heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening to my thoughts and judging me for being so blind. I placed my purse on the counter and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the faded floral tablecloth that had covered it for years, the one that still bore a faint stain from my granddaughter's spilled juice. I thought about the doctor's words, about the calm cruelty in my daughter's smile, and about how easily a lifetime of independence had been snatched away from me. I told myself it must be some kind of clerical error, that she couldn't really have the power to cancel something that belonged to me, that was tied to my social security number and my history of payments. Yet the doctor had spoken with the certainty of someone who knew the system, and my daughter had not denied it. She had smiled as though she had finally accomplished something she had been planning for a long time. The first thing I did was pick up the phone and call Medicare directly, holding my breath as the automated voice guided me through menus and endless options. When I finally reached a representative, the young man on the other end spoke with rehearsed politeness, asking for my date of birth, my address, and my social security number. He clicked his keyboard for a long moment before clearing his throat and saying, "Mrs. Robinson, according to our records, your coverage was voluntarily cancelled last month." I froze. Voluntarily? I demanded to know how that could be, because I had never signed or requested such a thing. He hesitated, then explained that the request came from an individual listed as my authorized representative with full power of attorney. The name he read out was my daughter's. The room seemed to spin, my heart thudding like a drum. Power of attorney? I had never given her that, never signed over that kind of authority. I asked him to send me copies of whatever paperwork they had, and he agreed. But his voice was distant, the way people speak when they are simply following a script. He reminded me that without active coverage, I was responsible for all medical costs out of pocket, and then he wished me a nice evening, as if what he had told me had not just dismantled the foundation of my security. I hung up the phone and sat there, the silence roaring in my ears. My daughter had taken something sacred, something that was supposed to be untouchable, but the greater betrayal was not the insurance itself. It was the fact that she had planned it, filled out forms, made calls, impersonated me, and never once thought to tell me. She had taken my voice and used it for her own advantage. I thought of how she had driven me to the appointment that day, her smug smile in the hallway, the way she had said, "Don't worry, Mama. I'll take care of you." Now the words made sense. She wasn't talking about care in the way I had once cared for her. She was talking about control. The next day, I went to the pharmacy to pick up my prescriptions. When I handed the clerk my Medicare card, she scanned it and then frowned, shaking her head. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Robinson, but this card is inactive. You'll have to pay full price." She said it loud enough for the people in line behind me to hear. I felt the sting of humiliation crawl up my neck as I reached into my purse, pulling out bills and coins with trembling fingers. The young woman waiting behind me whispered to her friend, and I knew they were judging me, assuming I was careless or irresponsible, when the truth was that my own daughter had orchestrated this scene. I paid $87 for 2 small bottles of pills that normally cost me nothing, and I left the store with tears burning in my eyes. When I got home, my daughter was in the living room, her shoes kicked off, sipping wine from one of my glasses, and scrolling through her phone as if she owned the place. Shopping bags littered the couch, with logos from expensive boutiques that I had never stepped foot in. I asked her directly, my voice shaking but firm, why she had cancelled my Medicare. She didn't even look up at me right away. When she finally did, Her eyes were cold, her tone dismissive. "Mama, you don't need to worry about those details anymore. I'm handling your finances. Medicare doesn't give you the best care anyway. I'll decide what's best for you from now on." The fury that rose in me was unlike anything I had felt before, a hot rush of indignation that mixed with sorrow. I told her that I was not senile, that I had never given her power of attorney, that she had no right. She laughed, a light, cruel laugh that sent a chill through my bones, and said, "It's already done. The papers are filed, the accounts are updated, and if you fight me, you'll only make yourself look crazy. Do you want to end up in a home?" Her words knocked the breath out of me. A home. She was threatening me with the very place I had worked in for years, where I had watched forgotten elders cry themselves to sleep, where families visited once a year and left quickly, as though ashamed to be reminded of their obligations. I had promised myself I would never end up in such a place, and here was my daughter, using that fear like a weapon. Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat in my bedroom surrounded by old photo albums. I looked at pictures of her as a little girl, her arms wrapped around my neck, her smile bright and unguarded. I remembered birthdays where I scraped together enough to buy her gifts, Christmas mornings where I cooked feasts out of almost nothing, long nights where I worked overtime so she could have school clothes as nice as the other children. I remembered whispering to her that she was my pride, my joy, the reason I kept pushing through the exhaustion. And now she had turned all of that love into leverage, twisting my trust into shackles. The catalyst was not just the doctor's words or the cancelled card. It was the realization that my daughter had crossed a line she could never uncross. She had chosen money and power over respect. She had chosen convenience over dignity. And as much as it broke my heart, I knew that if I did not fight back, I would lose everything, not just my coverage, but my very right to be seen as a capable woman, to be treated as human. That knowledge sat heavy on my chest, pressing against me until I could barely breathe. But it also lit a flame inside me, small at first, but growing stronger with every passing hour. I sat there in the stillness of my bedroom, clutching a photograph of my younger self in my nursing uniform, the years when I had been the caretaker, the provider, the strong one. I whispered into the quiet, not to my daughter this time, but to myself. She doesn't get to decide who I am. She doesn't get to take what I've earned. Not without a fight. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair. I felt resolve. The following week unfolded like a slow-motion disaster, each day pulling me further into a reality I had never imagined I would live in. I began to notice small but deliberate changes in my life, changes that all pointed back to my daughter's interference. At first it was the pharmacy visit that had humiliated me in front of strangers. Then it was the letter that came in the mail, addressed not to me but to her, regarding my Social Security payments. I tore the envelope open with trembling hands and read words that made my stomach drop. The checks that had always come directly to me would now be deposited into a joint account managed by my daughter as my financial representative. I sat at the kitchen table, the paper shaking in my hands, my heart hammering as if it wanted to claw its way out of my chest. I had not agreed to this. I had not signed anything. Yet here it was, black ink on official letterhead, telling me that the money I had worked for all my life was no longer mine to control. I called the number listed on the notice, waited nearly an hour through hold music that drilled into my head, and finally spoke with another polite stranger who confirmed it. "Your representative payee is now listed as your daughter," he said matter-of-factly. "She has full authority over your benefits. If you have concerns, you can request a review, but it requires documentation and a formal process." His tone was calm, neutral, the tone of someone who delivered this kind of news every day. But to me, it felt like a death sentence. My money, my coverage, my independence. Piece by piece it was being carved away, and the person holding the knife was the very child I had sacrificed everything to raise. The true escalation came when I tried to make a doctor's appointment on my own, hoping that maybe I could pay cash, at least until I sorted things out. I called the office and explained my situation, but the receptionist, after putting me on hold, came back and said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Robinson, but your daughter has notified us that all appointments must be scheduled through her. She is listed as your caregiver of record." For a moment I could not breathe. My daughter had effectively barred me from even seeking medical care without her permission. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, and I realized then that she wasn't just managing my finances, she was cutting me off from my ability to make choices, to act, to live freely. I decided I needed to confront her directly, not with vague protests, but with evidence in hand. I gathered the letters, the cancelled Medicare card, the receipt from the pharmacy, and I spread them out on the kitchen table like battle plans. When she came home that evening, carrying shopping bags with high-end labels and smelling of perfume that I could never afford, I told her to sit down. At first, she tried to brush me off, saying she was tired, that she had a headache, that we could talk later. But I insisted, my voice steady, though my knees were trembling under the table. I pointed to the papers and demanded to know what she had done. Her face was expressionless, her eyes cold. "Mama," she said slowly, as if speaking to a child, "you don't understand how the world works anymore. Bills, insurance, banks, it's too much for you." "I'm just making sure things don't slip through the cracks," I told her she had no right, that I had never signed over authority, and she leaned back in the chair, crossing her arms, her lips curling into that same smile I had seen at the clinic. "Maybe you don't remember signing," she said. "Maybe you forgot. But the papers are filed. It's official. You can't change it now." The audacity of her lie hit me like a blow. I told her I had never forgotten anything so important in my life, that I knew exactly what I had signed and what I hadn't. Her eyes flashed with irritation, and she stood abruptly, slamming her hands against the table. The glasses rattled, and I flinched. "You don't get it," she snapped. "I'm in charge now. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." I wanted to shout back, to tell her that she was still my child and had no authority over me. But in that moment, I realized the depth of the trap I was in. She had the paperwork, the banks, the doctor's office, and the pharmacy on her side. On paper, I was already under her control. Even if it was built on forgery and lies, the system believed her. I felt like a ghost in my own life, erased from the records that once bore my name. The humiliation grew heavier when I went to church that Sunday. After service, as I stood in line for coffee in the fellowship hall, Sister Mary, who always prided herself on being well-informed, asked me in a loud voice if it was true that my daughter had taken over my finances because I was having memory problems. Heads turned, eyes widened, and I felt the heat rise in my face. I wanted to deny it, to shout that it was all a lie, but the whispers had already started. My daughter had planted the story, and now it was spreading through the very community I had leaned on all my life. I excused myself, left my cup of coffee untouched, and walked home with my head down, every step feeling heavier than the last. At home, the situation worsened. My daughter began rationing the money she gave me, handing me $20 here, $10 there, like I was a child receiving allowance. When I asked for more to cover groceries, she smirked and said, "Don't worry about it." I'll do the shopping. You just focus on resting, resting. As if my worth had been reduced to sitting quietly in a corner, waiting for her to decide when I could eat, when I could see a doctor, when I could leave the house. The refrigerator began to fill with foods I didn't like or couldn't digest well, but she didn't care. "It's healthier for you," she would say dismissively, as though my preferences, my history, my own body no longer mattered. One afternoon, I tried to withdraw money from the ATM, thinking maybe I still had some funds left in my personal account. I walked slowly to the bank, the sun hot against my back, my cane clicking against the sidewalk. When I inserted my card, the screen flashed. Insufficient funds. I tried again, certain I must have made a mistake, but the result was the same. I went inside, stood in line, and asked the teller to check my balance. She pulled up the account and then looked at me with polite pity. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Robinson," she said, "but this account has been closed at your request. All funds were transferred to a joint account with your daughter. I could barely stand. My legs wobbled, and I had to grip the counter to steady myself. I had not requested anything. My signature had been forged, my identity stolen, not by a stranger, but by my own child. I left the bank in a daze, the sidewalk blurring beneath my feet. On the corner, I ran into my neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins, who frowned when she saw my expression. She asked if I was all right, and I almost lied, almost said I was fine. But the words tumbled out before I could stop them. I told her about the insurance, the money, the bank account. Her eyes widened, and she lowered her voice to a whisper. "Honey, I saw your daughter at the bank last week with a folder of papers." She looked mighty pleased with herself. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now—" Her words trailed off, but I knew what she was thinking. My daughter had stolen from me in broad daylight, and no one had stopped her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every betrayal. Each act, each forged paper, each dismissive laugh, all of it stacked up inside me like bricks in a wall meant to shut me out of my own life. I thought of all the women in my community, women my age who whispered about being pressured by their children, about being treated like burdens once they retired. I had listened with sympathy, never thinking it could happen to me, never imagining that my daughter, my flesh and blood, would be the one to tighten the noose around my independence. But as the hours dragged on, something inside me began to shift. The sorrow was still there, heavy and suffocating. But beneath it, a spark of anger flared, small but steady. I realized that if I did nothing, I would be erased completely, and my daughter would continue to smile as she tightened her grip. I could not allow that. I would not allow that. For the first time in days, I sat up in bed, grabbed a notebook, and began to write down everything I knew, every phone call, every letter, every conversation, every receipt. If my daughter wanted to turn my life into a case file, then I would build one of my own. The escalation had begun, and I understood now that this was not just a disagreement between mother and daughter. This was war, fought not with fists or guns, but with papers, signatures, lies, and dignity. And I refused to lose without a fight. By the time the next month arrived, I had already begun to realize that the quiet, private humiliations were not isolated incidents, but part of something larger, more calculated, and far more dangerous than I had admitted even to myself. I had been keeping my notes diligently, every envelope, every receipt, every conversation recorded in the plain spiral notebook I hid beneath the stack of linens in my closet. It gave me a sense of control, as if by writing things down, I could reclaim a piece of the authority that had been stolen from me. Yet notes alone were not enough. I needed something stronger, something undeniable that could not be dismissed as the faulty memory of an elderly woman. And as the days passed, I began to search through old files, boxes, and drawers, hoping to find some proof that might anchor me against the tide of forged documents and fabricated narratives my daughter had spun around me. One afternoon, when she was out shopping or perhaps meeting friends, I no longer asked where she went. I climbed into the attic, where the dust hung heavy and the air smelled of cedar and old paper. I pulled down boxes I had not touched in decades, containers of tax returns, letters, deeds, and photographs. It was there, buried in a folder marked with my late husband's name, that I found the one document that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was the durable power of attorney he and I had signed together years ago when he was preparing for surgery, the kind of paperwork people complete in case something goes wrong. The original bore both our signatures and the clear statement that no one else, not even our daughter, was to be granted authority over finances or medical decisions unless we were incapacitated. He had passed, but the clause protecting my autonomy remained. Holding the paper in my hands, I felt something fierce stir inside me, the sense that maybe, finally, I had found the anchor I had been searching for. I carefully slipped the document into a protective sleeve and tucked it into my notebook, as though it were a jewel. Yet even as relief settled over me, another realization struck. If I had this original copy, then whatever papers my daughter had submitted to Medicare, to the bank, to Social Security, had been falsified. She had forged my signature, maybe even fabricated entire forms, and the thought of it made my stomach clench. This wasn't simply control, it was fraud, and it was punishable if only I could survive long enough to prove it. The following Sunday, after service, I lingered in the fellowship hall rather than rushing out as I had the week before. My neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins, caught me by the arm and lowered her voice. She told me she had seen my daughter at the bank again, and this time she had overheard her boasting to one of the tellers about getting things under control for her mother. I pressed Mrs. Jenkins for details, and she admitted she had snapped a quick photograph on her phone. Just instinct, she said, in case she ever needed to remember. She showed me the image. My daughter standing at the counter, folder open, papers spread across the desk, her face lit with that satisfied smile. It wasn't evidence in a courtroom sense, but it was a start, a thread that connected to the tangled web I was beginning to unravel. When I returned home, I found my daughter waiting for me in the living room, her posture stiff, her eyes narrowed. She asked where I had been, why I had taken so long, why I had spoken with certain people after service. There was a sharpness to her questions that sent a shiver down my spine. She was watching me more closely now, suspicious of my every move, as though she sensed the shift in me. I answered calmly, keeping my tone light, refusing to show my fear, but inside I was trembling. I knew that the more she suspected I was fighting back, the tighter she would squeeze her grip. A few days later, the real turning point arrived. She came home with two strangers, a man in a suit, carrying a leather briefcase, and a woman in a blazer with a badge clipped to her pocket. They introduced themselves as a family attorney and a social worker, and they sat in my kitchen as if it were their office. My daughter stood behind them, her arms folded, her expression smug, while they explained that there were concerns about my ability to manage my affairs. They said they were beginning the process to review my competency, to determine whether I should be placed under legal guardianship. I sat there in stunned silence as they spoke, the words hitting me like stones. The lawyer slid a stack of papers across the table, asking for my signature, insisting it was routine, insisting it would protect me. I picked up one of the pages, my hands shaking, and I saw the language clearly. A petition to establish guardianship over me, naming my daughter as the petitioner and primary caregiver. My chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But then I remembered the notebook hidden upstairs, the photographs, and most of all the original power of attorney document that proved she had no right. I forced myself to set the paper down and said I needed time to review. The lawyer's mouth tightened, the social worker frowned, and my daughter laughed quietly in the background. "Mama, you can't understand those papers," she said with false sweetness. "Just sign. It's for your own good." But I did not sign. I told them politely but firmly that I would review the documents later, and I ushered them out of my kitchen with as much dignity as I could muster. My daughter glared at me as she followed them out, her eyes promising retribution. As soon as the door closed, I collapsed into the chair, my breath shallow, my hands still trembling. That was the moment I knew this was no longer about hurt feelings or family disagreements. This was a battle for my life as a free woman. That night, I retrieved my notebook, spread out the evidence, and whispered to myself that I was not crazy, that I was not forgetful, that I was not weak. I had the truth, and I had to protect it with everything I had. I thought of the women in my family who had survived worse. My grandmother who had endured segregation, my mother who had raised children on a maid's salary, women who had never been given the luxury of protection but had carved it out for themselves. I reminded myself that I carried their blood, their strength, their stubborn will to resist. The midpoint of my story was not a moment of triumph, not yet, but it was the pivot where despair turned into resolve. I knew now that my daughter's ambition was not going to stop on its own. It would only grow, consuming more of my life until nothing remained but the shell of a woman she controlled. But I also knew that somewhere inside the system she trusted so much, there were cracks, and if I placed the right weight on them, they would break. With the original document in hand, the photograph from the bank, and the courage that came from remembering who I was, I prepared myself for the next stage of the fight. I was terrified, yes, but also steadier than I had been in weeks, because now I had proof, and proof was the first weapon I could wield in a battle I never asked for, but would never abandon. The days that followed carried a heaviness I could not shake, as if the very air inside my home had been thickened with suspicion and silent threats. I knew my daughter had left the house angry after I refused to sign those papers, but I had not expected the speed or the ferocity of her retaliation. It began subtly, in ways that might have been dismissed as accidents if I had not already learned to look beneath the surface. Mail that I knew should have arrived went missing. Bills I had never seen suddenly appeared marked overdue, and neighbours who had once greeted me warmly now gave me hesitant smiles, their eyes shifting away as if they were unsure what to believe. It became clear to me that my daughter was not only tightening her grip within the walls of this house, but also poisoning the world outside it, shaping a narrative where she was the devoted caretaker of a confused old woman. And I was the problem, one wanted to deal with. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking on the phone in the next room, her voice lowered but sharp enough that her words cut through the air. She was telling someone, I could not tell if it was the lawyer or the social worker, that I was becoming paranoid, that I was hiding documents and refusing to take my medication, that I was forgetting conversations minutes after they happened. None of it was true, yet I knew how easily such lies could become accepted fact once written into a report. I sat frozen in my chair, my hand pressed against my chest, listening to my child dismantle my credibility with the ease of someone recounting the weather. When she hung up the phone, she walked into the kitchen with a smile as if nothing had happened, asking me if I wanted tea. And I realized in that moment that she had learned to weaponize her charm in ways that I had never imagined possible. The real blow came when I returned to my doctor's office, hoping to schedule an appointment using cash. I thought if I explained my situation carefully, perhaps they would let me bypass the restrictions and simply pay for the services I needed. Instead, the receptionist gave me a polite but firm look and told me that notes had been added to my file indicating that any medical decisions, including scheduling, required my daughter's consent. I protested, my voice breaking, insisting that I had not authorized this, that I was perfectly capable of handling my own appointments. The receptionist leaned in slightly and whispered, almost sympathetically, that my daughter had told the staff I was struggling with memory lapses and that she was doing everything she could to protect me. I walked out of that office with my cheeks burning, my heart heavy with shame. In the eyes of those who should have been my allies, I had been reduced to a fragile, confused woman, and it was my own flesh and blood who had painted me that way. As the weeks stretched on, the financial pressure began to crush me. I had lived frugally my entire life, always careful with money, always ensuring I had enough for the essentials. Now I found myself asking my daughter for small amounts, sometimes just enough for a bus fare or a loaf of bread, and she would hand it over with a smugness that left me feeling diminished. Once, when I asked for money to buy vegetables for supper, she tossed a $10 bill onto the table and said, "Make it stretch, Mama. I don't have time to keep fixing your mistakes." The cruelty in her voice was not loud, but it was sharp, cutting deeper than any shout could. She had learned that humiliation could be delivered quietly, in the everyday exchanges where dependence was reinforced like a chain. The turning point, the moment when the injustice became undeniable, came with a letter from the court. A thick envelope arrived, addressed not only to me, but also to my daughter as petitioner. Inside was a notice that a hearing had been scheduled to determine whether I should be declared legally incompetent and placed under permanent guardianship. I read the words over and over, my hands trembling, my breath catching in my throat. It was not just talk anymore, not just whispered threats or missing mail. It was real. There was a date, a judge, a courtroom, and my entire future laid out in legal language that treated me as though I were a piece of property in dispute. I confronted my daughter that evening, holding the letter in my hand, demanding to know how she could do this to me. She looked at me without flinching, her eyes cold and steady, and said, "Because it's for your own good. You'll thank me one day." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with the letter shaking in my grasp, my mouth open with words that refused to form. I wanted to scream, to shout the truth into her face, but all that came was silence, a silence that filled the house like smoke. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the unfairness of it all pressed against me like a weight I could not move. I had given my life to work, to family, to raising her with love and sacrifice. And now she was using the very system I had trusted to erase me. I thought of all the women I had cared for in the nursing home, women whose children had signed them away with a few strokes of a pen, their voices ignored as they were moved into rooms with linoleum floors and harsh lights. I had held their hands as they cried, promising myself I would never end up like them. And now, the path laid out before me threatened to lead in the same direction. Yet even as despair clawed at me, I clung to the knowledge that I was not powerless. I had the original documents in my possession, proof that her claims were lies. I had allies, however small, in neighbours who had seen her at the bank, in photographs that hinted at her schemes. The injustice of what was happening lit a fire inside me, a slow-burning anger that hardened into determination. If the courts wanted to hear evidence, then evidence they would have. If my daughter wanted to silence me, then she would find me louder than she had ever expected. The unfair twist of this chapter in my life was not only that my own child had turned against me, but that she had managed to bend the system to her will, to convince outsiders that she was the savior and I was the problem. It was a betrayal that went beyond family, beyond blood. It was the weaponization of trust itself. And though it broke my heart to acknowledge it, I knew now that I had to prepare for a battle, not only to save my independence, but to reclaim the truth of who I was. The date on that court letter became both a threat and a goal, a reminder that time was running short, but also that the moment of reckoning was coming. I would not walk into that room defeated. I would carry every scrap of proof, every word of testimony, every ounce of strength my ancestors had given me. The injustice was crushing, yes, but it was also clarifying. It showed me that the fight was not just necessary, it was unavoidable. The weeks leading up to the court hearing became a labyrinth of intimidation, manipulation, and relentless pressure, as if my daughter had decided that if she could not break me with paperwork, she would wear me down with isolation and fear. Every day carried some new insult, some fresh reminder that she held the keys not only to my finances, but also to the way others saw me. I began to feel the walls of my own home closing in, turning what had once been my sanctuary into a cage where every corner whispered betrayal. The first blow came when I attempted to confide in my pastor. I had arranged a quiet meeting in his office after Sunday service, clutching my notebook of evidence as if it were scripture itself. I poured out my story to him, describing the forged signatures, the cancelled Medicare, the stolen bank accounts. He listened with a patient expression, his hands folded on the desk, and when I finished, he cleared his throat and said gently, "Sister Robinson, your daughter has already spoken with me. She told me you were having difficulties remembering things and that you might be confusing facts. She asked me to pray for you, to keep you calm." My mouth went dry, my voice faltered, and I realized then that she had already poisoned this well too. The look in his eyes was not one of disbelief, but of pity, as though he were already convinced of her story. I left the office without another word, my cheeks burning, my notebook clutched tightly against my chest, like a shield that was starting to feel too heavy. At the grocery store, the humiliation deepened. I had managed to scrape together a few dollars in cash from sewing repairs for a neighbor, and I intended to buy some fresh vegetables, just enough to make a soup that reminded me of my mother's kitchen. But as I reached the register, my daughter appeared at my side, startling me. She greeted the cashier with an easy smile, slipped her card into the machine and said, "I'll take care of this. My mama forgets sometimes how to handle her money." Her voice was loud enough for those in line behind us to hear, and I felt their eyes boring into me, the weight of their assumptions pressing down like stones. I wanted to protest, to shout that I had managed money my entire life, that I had raised a daughter on a shoestring budget without ever missing a bill. But my throat closed, and the words lodged deep inside. I carried the bag of groceries home in silence while she walked beside me, humming as if she had just done me the greatest favor. The surveillance tightened as well. I noticed my mail no longer arriving directly to the house. When I asked the post office about it, they explained that a forwarding request had been filed, directing all correspondence to a P.O. box registered under my daughter's name. I nearly collapsed right there at the counter. Every letter, every bank statement, every notice meant for me was now being intercepted. She had not just taken my finances. She had stolen my voice, my ability to even receive the words others intended for me. The clerk at the counter gave me a sympathetic look, but rules were rules, and without proof, nothing could be changed. As the court date drew closer, my daughter's tactics became bolder. She arranged for a home visit by a medical examiner, a man she introduced as a nurse practitioner, sent to assess my competency. He sat at my kitchen table with a clipboard, asking me questions meant to trip me up. The date, the president's name, the season. I answered each one calmly, clearly, though my heart raced. But I noticed the way he glanced at my daughter before writing notes, as though her reactions carried more weight than my answers. At one point, she interrupted to say, "Mama, remember what we talked about last night? Don't get confused. It was a trap, a subtle suggestion planted in front of him to paint me as unreliable." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm, refusing to let her performance push me into anger that could be used against me. Even my neighbors began to shift. Mrs. Jenkins, who had once been sympathetic, now avoided my eyes, and when I pressed her about it, she admitted that my daughter had visited her, saying she was worried about my wandering and asking her to keep an eye out. I felt my breath leave me, my face flush with shame. My own daughter had reduced me to a neighborhood rumor, turning me into a spectacle to be pitied and monitored rather than a woman to be respected. The isolation was complete. No ally seemed untouched by her poison, no corner of my life safe from her reach. One night, unable to sleep, I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one that still smelled faintly of my late husband's cologne. Inside were mementos of a life spent working, fighting, surviving. Pay stubs from the years I cleaned houses, letters from grateful families at the nursing home, photographs of me in my uniform smiling though my body ached from endless shifts. I ran my fingers over those papers and realized that I had spent a lifetime proving myself to the world, only to reach an age where proof seemed to mean nothing at all. My daughter's words carried more weight than my history, her lies louder than my truth, and yet, buried in that chest, I found another weapon, a file of medical records, tax forms, and bank receipts that all bore my true signature, clear and steady, a handwriting that had never faltered. These documents became my arsenal, small pieces of evidence that I knew could one day pierce through the fog of her deception. Still, the psychological war continued. She began leaving pamphlets on my nightstand about assisted living facilities, brochures filled with smiling seniors playing bingo under fluorescent lights. She would point to them casually, saying, "Wouldn't it be nice to have company all the time? Meals cooked for you? No more worrying about bills?" Her voice was honeyed, but the threat underneath was unmistakable. She was reminding me daily of the fate she had planned, pushing me toward the very destiny I had sworn to avoid. The breaking point came one evening when I overheard her on the phone again, this time with someone she addressed as counselor. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh, don't worry. By the time the hearing comes around, Mama won't have anything left to stand on. I've already taken care of the rest." Her confidence was chilling, her certainty like ice in my veins. I realized then that she believed she had already won, that in her mind the outcome was not even a question. That arrogance became my fuel. I spent the days that followed organizing my evidence with meticulous care. I made copies of the original power of attorney document. I photographed every letter and receipt. I wrote detailed accounts of each incident in my notebook. I stored duplicates in the cedar chest, in the lining of my winter coat, even slipped one copy to a trusted acquaintance at church, whom my daughter had not yet managed to poison. I knew the danger I was in, but I also knew that survival depended on preparation. She could control the money, the mail, even the narrative in the community, but she could not erase the truth if I guarded it carefully. The escalation was suffocating, pressing on every side, but it also sharpened my resolve. The system was stacked against me, my reputation smeared, my independence shredded. Yet somewhere inside the storm, I felt the steady rhythm of determination. My daughter thought she had caged me, but she had forgotten something vital. I had lived too many lives, endured too many battles, to surrender quietly. The fire she had tried to smother was now blazing, and though the path ahead was dark and treacherous, I knew I would walk it with my head high, carrying the truth like a torch no one could extinguish. The day of the hearing arrived with the kind of grey sky that seemed to press down on the city, heavy with a promise of rain that never quite came. I woke before dawn, unable to sleep, my mind replaying every insult, every humiliation, every calculated move my daughter had made to strip me of my independence. I dressed carefully, choosing a dark blue dress I had kept pressed for years, the one I had worn to my husband's funeral. I wanted to look dignified, unshaken, a woman who carried her history proudly. My hands trembled as I buttoned the cuffs, but once I looked in the mirror, I steadied myself. The reflection staring back at me was not a frail woman to be pitied, but a survivor, someone who had already endured storms far greater than this one. When I entered the courthouse, the sterile chill of the building settled into my bones. My daughter was already there, sitting with her lawyer at the long wooden table. She wore a fitted suit and a string of pearls I had once given her for her graduation, and when her eyes met mine, she did not flinch. Instead, she smiled, that same cold smile I had seen in the clinic hallway months before, a smile that said she believed the battle was already won. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man with slick hair and a smooth voice, shuffled papers with the casual confidence of someone who thought he would not be challenged. I sat across from them, my own folder of documents clutched tightly in my lap, every page carefully prepared, every note handwritten, every piece of proof like a weapon I was ready to draw. The judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes who looked over the courtroom with brisk efficiency. The case was called, and my daughter's lawyer stood first. He began with a polished speech about how my daughter had only my best interests at heart, how she had stepped in to manage my affairs when I could no longer handle them. He spoke of supposed lapses in memory, of unpaid bills, of confusion over appointments, all fabrications that rolled off his tongue as though they were undeniable facts. My daughter nodded along solemnly, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had brought for effect, though I noticed there were no real tears. When it was my turn to speak, my heart pounded so hard I thought the entire courtroom could hear it. I rose slowly, gripping the table for balance, and addressed the judge with as much steadiness as I could muster. I told her I had worked my entire life, never once failing to provide for myself or my family, never once missing a bill or forgetting an obligation. I explained that my daughter had taken control not through consent, but through deception, through forged signatures and lies whispered into the ears of those willing to believe her. The judge listened, her expression unreadable, and for a moment I feared that my words were not enough. That was when I reached into my folder and pulled out the original durable power of attorney document, the one signed decades ago, still bearing the ink of my late husband's steady hand and my own. I held it up and explained that this document clearly stated no authority was to be granted to anyone else, not even my daughter, unless I was incapacitated, which I was not. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but before he could object, I placed the document into the clerk's hands. The judge examined it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. My daughter leaned forward then, her voice rising with false urgency. She claimed I was confused, that I must have forgotten signing the new documents, that perhaps I had mixed up dates or forms. Her words dripped with feigned concern, but the confidence in her tone wavered when I calmly produced the second piece of evidence. The photographs Mrs. Jenkins had given me, showing my daughter at the bank with my documents spread across the counter. The judge asked pointedly if my daughter had handled my financial affairs without proper authorization, and her lawyer quickly tried to object. but the weight of the evidence was already shifting. Finally, with my hands shaking but my voice strong, I revealed the audio recording I had secretly made the night she boasted on the phone about cancelling my Medicare to keep me from wasting money on doctors. The courtroom grew still as her voice filled the space, clear and unmistakable. By the time the hearing comes around, Mama won't have anything left to stand on. I've already taken care of the rest. The words hung in the air like poison, undeniable, irretrievable. My daughter's face drained of colour, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze hard and steady. She asked my daughter directly if she had cancelled my Medicare coverage. At first my daughter stammered, trying to weave another lie, but the audio had already destroyed her credibility. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. The lawyer shuffled his papers, his smooth voice suddenly caught in his throat. For the first time, I saw something flicker across my daughter's face that was not arrogance or confidence. It was fear. I spoke then, not to the judge, not to the lawyer, but directly to my daughter. I told her I had raised her with everything I had, that I had poured years of labour, sacrifice, and love into making sure she had a future, and that she had taken that love and twisted it into chains meant to bind me. My voice did not waver. I told her that while she had tried to erase me, I was still here, still standing, and still capable of fighting for myself. The courtroom was silent, every pair of eyes fixed on us, the weight of truth finally tipping in my favour. The judge called a recess to review the evidence, and when she returned, her ruling was clear. She dismissed the petition for guardianship, citing the original document, the photographic evidence, and the audio recording as proof of misconduct. She ordered an investigation into the forged paperwork and the unauthorized financial transactions. My daughter sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her carefully constructed facade crumbling in front of everyone. As the gavel struck, the release that coursed through me was almost overwhelming. My body trembled, not from fear this time, but from the sheer force of relief, from the knowledge that I had been heard, that my truth had not been buried under her lies. For months I had carried the weight of humiliation, isolation, and despair. But in that moment, standing in the courtroom with my dignity restored, I felt lighter than I had in years. Walking out of the courthouse, I did not look back at my daughter. Her footsteps echoed behind me, quick and uneven, but I kept my head high, the folder of evidence still clutched tightly in my hands. For the first time in a long while, I felt the ground beneath me solid and sure. The climax of this battle had come, and though the scars would remain, I knew that I had stood my ground and forced the truth into the light. No matter what came next, she could no longer deny who I was or what I had fought to reclaim. When the courthouse doors closed behind me, the cool air hit my face like a cleansing wind, and for the first time in months, I felt as if I could breathe without the weight of dread pressing down on my chest. The echo of the gavel still rang in my ears, not as a sound of judgment, but as the rhythm of release. The final strike that had shattered the chain my daughter had tried to fasten around me. I walked down the wide stone steps slowly, clutching the folder of evidence to my chest, as though it were both shield and scripture. The proof that I had not been erased, that my voice had carried through the noise and been heard. Each step steadied me, reminded me of who I was, and by the time I reached the sidewalk, my back had straightened, my head lifted, and I no longer felt like prey cowering in a trap. My daughter trailed behind me, her heels striking the pavement in short, clipped beats that betrayed her agitation. I did not turn to look at her. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said in front of the judge, nothing to reclaim from the wreckage of our relationship that she had not already set ablaze. For months, she had spoken over me, spoken for me, reshaping me into a caricature of confusion and fragility. But now the world had heard her lies in her own voice, had seen her arrogance laid bare, and I no longer needed to argue or defend myself. The silence between us was no longer suffocating. It was freedom. In the weeks that followed, I began the slow process of reclaiming my life. Medicare reinstated my coverage after reviewing the fraudulent cancellation, and the first time I picked up my prescriptions without handing over cash, I nearly wept with relief. My Social Security benefits were redirected back into my own account, and though the balance was modest, it was mine, each dollar earned through the sweat of decades of labor. I visited the bank to close the joint account my daughter had opened, and the teller, perhaps recognizing the situation, treated me with a kind of deference that felt almost reverent. When I walked out of that branch with the confirmation slip in my hand, I held it up to the sunlight as though it were a flag of victory. The investigation into my daughter's actions began quietly, but grew louder as officials uncovered the breadth of her manipulations. I was interviewed by a federal investigator who treated me not as a frail victim, but as a credible witness, his questions sharp but respectful. He took copies of the forged paperwork, the audio recording, and the bank photographs, assuring me that what she had done was not merely a family dispute, but a crime. When I heard the word fraud spoken aloud in that sterile office, it sent a chill through me, because I had spent so long framing it as betrayal, as hurt, as family brokenness. To hear it described in the cold, factual language of law stripped it of sentiment and forced me to see it plainly. My daughter had committed crimes against me. It was not easy to live with that knowledge. Nights were still heavy, filled with memories of her as a child, the girl I had braided hair for, the girl I had worked double shifts to feed and clothe, the girl whose laughter once filled this house. There were moments when the grief was nearly unbearable, when I questioned whether the victory in court was worth the loss of what remained between us. But every time doubt crept in, I would open my notebook, run my fingers over the pages of evidence, and remind myself that the fight had never been about punishing her. It had been about saving myself. The community that had once looked at me with pity began to look at me differently. At church, Sister Mary clasped my hands tightly after service and whispered, "We were wrong to doubt you. You showed us all what strength looks like." Neighbors who had believed my daughter's rumors now greeted me with cautious respect, their smiles tentative but genuine. Even my pastor, who had once prayed over me with eyes clouded by her lies, stood in the pulpit one Sunday and spoke of the importance of truth, of listening to those who are silenced. And though he never said my name, I knew his words were meant for me. Slowly, I began to stitch my life back together. I cleaned out the drawers and closets of every paper that bore her hand, replacing them with copies of my own records carefully filed and protected. I kept duplicates with trusted allies, determined that never again would my life be so easily stolen with the stroke of a pen. I returned to small rituals I had abandoned during the months of despair, tending to the flowers in the front yard, baking sweet bread for neighbors, taking long walks in the early evening when the sky burned orange with sunset. Each act, small as it was, felt like a reclamation, a declaration that I was not finished, not broken, not erased. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, Mrs. Jenkins joined me. She placed her hand on mine and said softly, "You know, you gave the rest of us courage. We've all heard stories, but you stood up in the light and proved the truth." Her words settled into me like balm, and I realized that my fight had rippled beyond my own walls. It had become a reminder to other women, other mothers, other elders, who whispered in fear of being silenced by their own kin, that resistance was possible. that dignity could be defended even against those who shared your blood. As for my daughter, I do not know what became of her once the investigation deepened. Letters arrived from lawyers, updates trickled in from officials, but I no longer followed them with the same intensity. Whether she faced charges, whether she rebuilt her life elsewhere, whether she ever confronted the reality of what she had done, none of it could undo the months of torment or return the trust that had been shattered. I released that burden because I had to. Holding on to her betrayal would only chain me to the very pain I had fought so hard to escape. The true resolution came not in the courtroom, nor in the reinstatement of my benefits, but in the quiet of my own heart when I realized I was free again to choose. To choose what I ate when I saw the doctor, how I spent my money, where I walked, who I spoke to. Freedom had been stripped from me not by strangers or by the government, but by the person I had once loved most, and reclaiming it felt both tender and fierce. I knew the scars would remain, that trust would always be complicated, that loneliness might creep in at night when the house grew too still. But I also knew that I had survived, and survival had always been the language of women like me. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening and the cicadas began their chorus, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I thought of my grandmother and my mother, women who had endured a world that doubted them at every turn, and I felt their strength running through my veins. I whispered into the gathering dark that I had not broken, that I had not been erased, that I was still here. The fight was behind me, but the dignity I had reclaimed would walk beside me for the rest of my days.